Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. This is episode number 21. I am Mike, that is Gavin. And Gavin, we made it to 21. Cheers, man.
We absolutely did. Clink.
Clink indeed. We agreed on the last episode that we were going to record this episode in honor of our 21st episode. We were going to record this episode while having a drink, and before we started recording, I brought this up to Gavin, and his response was, "Wait, we're doing that?"
Right. I was like, "Wait, are we were serious?" I'm like, "I'm down. Like, I'll go grab a beer or something." But so we are both enjoying an adult beverage. If you are of age and it's you're not at work or something, feel free to do the same.
Absolutely. And if you choose not to, that is just as well with all of us. Whatever floats your boat. What are you drinking, buddy?
I am drinking a Sam Adams Boston Lager. It's an oldie but a goodie.
Absolutely. The Sam Adams. It's maybe it's because I'm a history teacher, but big fan.
What about you? What do you got?
I've got some Johnny Walker Scotch. First time I've ever had Scotch, and I'm a fan. I'm a fan.
I don't think I've ever had like actual Scotch. I don't know what that means, to be honest.
To be honest, neither do I. I've only discovered in the last year or so that I'm a whiskey man, and I am slowly and clumsily exploring the world that whiskey has to offer for me.
You know, it's really funny, actually. I think for all of our listeners who don't actually know us, Mike and I and our group of friends, we typically do like a Secret Santa type exchange every year. Obviously, we couldn't get together this past year for 2020 into 21 for...
You didn't get invited?
I'm
just kidding, buddy.
What? Anyway, yeah, for obvious reasons, we did not have our little friend family get together. But let's see, I think it was 2018 into 2020. Our friend Ricky had me, and he actually got me a book about the science of alcohol.
Oh, really?
Right. Really. It's called Proof, the Science of Liquor or liquor or alcohol. I don't remember.
That's a great name.
Right. It's, I haven't fully read it. I've perused it, but I've not fully read it. I've been busy over the last couple of years. But
that's one of those books that doesn't need to be read. It just needs to be kind of skimmed every now and again.
Exactly. Anyway, we're a couple minutes into the episode. We should probably actually start talking about some science.
Well, before we get talking about what it is today, let's go ahead and talk about this week in science history. I'm going to go with 2018.
You had two chances because we're doing a weekend one, and you missed both.
Struck out on both.
You're gonna get one eventually. I know it.
You do like the weekend ones, though. I don't know if it's because there's two of them or what, but you're a big fan of the weekend.
Well, okay, it's mostly just because it's two chances to get an actual one that's kind of relevant to the podcast.
Okay.
In this case, both of them are sort of related. So first, we have from May 8th, 2013. The headline is Macaw Genome Sequenced. Now, if you had to say what kind of animal a macaw was, do you know what that is?
I mean, I hear caw, and I'm thinking bird.
It is, in fact, a bird. It is a type of parrot.
Okay. Okay.
The scarlet macaw is probably the most famous one. It's like pretty bright red with some blue on it. I'm sure you've seen it. They use it in a lot of movies and stuff. But,
sure.
So macaw genome sequenced. So it says, geneticists from Texas A&M University announced that they had successfully sequenced the full genome of the scarlet macaw, an achievement that meaningfully expands the world's understanding of avian evolution and biology, and may help in conservation efforts for endangered bird species.
Okay. And so let me ask you this question when it comes to this, because I know I've heard of like the Human Genome Project that finished way ahead of schedule. And, we have the human genome mapped out. How many other species do we have that mapped out? Like, is that a routine thing? Like, we have the genome for every living species, or,
oh, not even
all
close.
Of the big ones? Okay.
Not even close.
Is that a resources thing? Is that a, like, no one cares thing? Is that, like, why don't we? Because that seems like the kind of thing we should have.
Well, so it's mostly just, like, what's being prioritized. I don't know specifically why, they chose macaws. Macaws, specifically the scarlet macaws, are very highly endangered. But so it kind of really just depends on whoever's working on what, and what tools they happen to have access to.
Right.
So like human genome, that's just obviously a benefit for everybody. That's a benefit for like, evolution stuff. That's a benefit, I'm sure, for medical stuff. But as for how many we actually have, I would think the majority of genomes that we have sequenced are actually for things like bacteria and viruses,
Hmm.
just because the vast majority of scientific funding is for medical research, and those are the most medically relevant things.
I guess that makes sense.
And also,
Hmm.
bacterial and viral genomes are typically, I don't want to say always, but typically much, much shorter than our genome.
Really?
Much, much shorter.
I'm not sure what I would have guessed, but I guess that's interesting to know.
It's mostly the fact that like uh, they their DNA or potentially RNA in the case of viruses is just laid out sort of differently. So in most eukaryotic organisms, actually, I think all eukaryotic organisms, so basically things that are not bacteria.
Hmm.
Um, we have organelles in our cells. Going way back to like ninth grade biology here, probably even before that, honestly. But your cell has a cell wall with a bunch of organelle things inside of it that do different things. Basically, organs like in your body, but in your cell. Um, Bacteria are prokaryotes and don't have that. So, like in eukaryotes, we have the nucleus of your cell, which is where all of your DNA stays. Cells or bacteria don't have that. They have what's called just a plasmid. It's essentially just like a little pocket of DNA that isn't sort of self-contained, like the nucleus of your cell is. It just sort of free floats sort of around,
That seems
inside.
inefficient.
Yeah, it's. I mean, they get by, but yeah, it's just generally much shorter, and that's also probably partially because bacterial cells are much much smaller than animal cells as well.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, but yeah, so the second one here is from 2019, so you were close, but not quite.
Seems to be a running theme.
And it's a little misleading, honestly. It says oldest known trees identified in North America.
Okay.
Now,
So
when I read that, that to me sounds like the oldest fossil trees. Maybe that's just because I'm a paleontologist that I
I
immediately think
that's not the
fossil.
way I took that, but okay.
Okay, how did you take it then?
I took that as like we're counting rings on living trees, and we found the one with the most rings.
Interesting. So you mean like the oldest individual tree, like that?
Yes, and I know
Okay.
that sometimes like individual trees can like that line can get more blurry than you might
Hmm.
expect,
Right.
but that's like
Not
that's
as
where
much,
my
not as much with trees as with a lot of
okay.
other plants. A lot of other plants, there'll be like a shoot of it, and then the roots underground will connect to another shoot. So it might look like they're different individuals, but they're actually the same.
Hmm.
Trees tend to not do that.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
yeah, generally trees are just a
Their own thing.
single. Right. Yeah. But anyway, it says biologists from the University of Arkansas identified what they believe to be the oldest discovered trees in North America, located in a stand of cypress trees in North Carolina. The oldest was dated to at least 2,624 years old and happens
Whew.
to have survived both drought and flood conditions.
2,624 years, you said?
Yes, so it is.
Oh,
They don't really specify, but I would assume that this is a still living tree. So I believe that that's what they were getting at, is the oldest living tree in North America.
good. I didn't think that was possible.
Yeah, I think I'm sure I've said this before on the podcast, but I'm positive that I will say it again. I do not understand plants. I just don't. Like, there are so many things about plants that I just straight up do not understand, and probably never will, realistically.
Wow. So I all right. So I looked up oldest living tree or list of oldest living trees on Wikipedia,
Right.
and the oldest one says it is 4,900 plus years old.
Okay, do tell.
It is named Prometheus, and it's in Nevada in the United States. So I guess I'm not
Okay.
100%. Yeah, we have a conflict.
I'm gonna err on the side of the calendar being wrong, honestly. um, I don't know. With science
Okay.
things, Wikipedia actually tends to be fairly reliable, to be honest.
Depending, I teach all of my students this. As long as you know how to use Wikipedia and you're not a dum dum about it,
Hmm.
it is perhaps the greatest resource that has ever existed in human history.
Oh, 100%. And like, so I had to write a paper recently, and this is very much off topic for what we're talking about today, but we'll circle back to it. Uh, I had to write a paper, and our teacher gave us a choice. It was about an isotope. So, for anyone who does not know, an isotope is basically an atom. So, say oxygen. Oxygen has 8 protons. That is what makes it oxygen. An isotope is basically just when it has a different number of neutrons. Normally, oxygen has 8 neutrons as well.
Hmm.
Oxygen isotopes have a different number. So that's why sometimes you hear it most often with things like carbon. So you hear, if you've ever heard of like carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14, those are all different isotopes of carbon. Um, and so we had to basically pick an isotope for this class, and she gave us an option to either write about it in like a scientific way or in a way more geared toward like a more general audience, like not writing to other scientists. So I chose that one, and one of the pictures that I got was from Wikipedia, and I cited it appropriately because the data and uh, I'm sure it depends on the actual image, but this particular one was very explicit in where they got the data for this figure because it wasn't just like a picture; it was a graph. Um, it's like, okay, we got the numbers for this graph from this paper, a paper that I was already referencing in my thing. So I'm like, okay, I've seen these data. Uh, the figure that they made matches up with it, but it was not published by the people who made the paper. It was basically compiling all of their data into a figure that made more sense.
Which is like exactly what Wikipedia is good for.
Right. But my teacher kind of gave me crap for it.
That's
And I'm like, okay,
I
this is an unpublished figure, but it's using published data that I'm also
right.
referencing. So what's the problem here?
I'm gonna get in trouble for this one of these days, but I frequently tell my students that the only people that uh, are mad about students using Wikipedia, if it's done appropriately, is like middle school English teachers that are just upset
Hmm.
that you have it easier than they did when it comes to research projects. Like, and at some point, I'm gonna get in trouble for that, but I maintain it. And by the way, when it comes to this, the tree I reference is actually dead.
Ah, okay.
So, yeah, so we have
Gotcha.
the oldest known living tree is 4,852 years old in the United States.
Interesting. So
So
either
a
way,
little
the
bit young.
calendar's wrong.
Yeah, we have Methuselah in the
I
White
have
Mountains
heard
of
of that one,
California.
actually. I have heard of that one.
Yeah, so
Interesting.
apparently that's right. But I think I can see how old was the one you referenced.
About 2,600.
I believe I can see where that one is. Does it happen to be in North Carolina?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So that one is high up here.
Okay.
And it is I looks like the second oldest one in North America that is still living.
Gotcha. All right.
So yeah, cool,
But
very cool stuff. We are talking about stuff that today, I don't know, living and dead, I suppose. It's been going on for a while. Gavin, do you want to introduce the actual topic that we're going over today?
absolutely. So one of our little, this week in science things talked about birds. And birds are going to be something that we talk about a bit today, but it's not going to be all about birds because today we're talking about flight and the evolution of flying things, which is super neat and also at the same time so incredibly weird. So, uh, my first question for you, Mike, is how many different groups do you think evolved flight throughout all of, Earth history?
How many different groups? When you say groups, are you referring? And I know we've talked about the
Basically,
limitations of
like
this.
kinds of
Okay.
animals.
Oh goodness, throughout human history.
No,
So,
throughout all of Earth
or I'm sorry,
history.
not
Yep.
yeah. When I said human history, I meant just like
That's just your reflex,
other.
huh?
Yeah, right. There's humans and there's everything else. Who cares?
Okay.
Oh goodness. So like we've obviously got birds,
Right.
and
There's one.
we've talked before about how like dinosaurs are related to birds. So I'm gonna say that those are one category for any type of flying dinosaur. And I'm trying to think of other things. that I know that happen to fly, and
Mm-hmm.
of course I'm like coming up blank. Like bats, I
Yep.
guess. I don't know if I'm assuming that's part of a larger category of things.
Bats?
Yeah, like is bats
No,
part of like?
bats are their own thing.
Are they really?
We
Okay,
we will talk about them.
interesting. All right, so we've got bats, birds. Oh, good. Yeah,
So you're currently you're at like 2.5 out of 4. I'll give you that there's 4.
So is dinosaurs like its own category?
So the only so it's actually a little tricky. We will talk more about that. The reason why you get a half is
Mm-hmm.
because the things that you are thinking of are not dinosaurs.
Oh goodness. And
We've
you
we've
know what?
we've talked about that.
I was gonna say I was a little bit worried. I feel like we have talked about why,
Where
like,
the things that
yeah,
most people would call pterodactyls
right.
are
Are
not dinosaurs.
yes, we have mentioned that before.
Yes. So those are 3 of the 4.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more flying. Is this going to be something where I'm going to be really upset once you tell me because I should have gotten it?
Yes. It is literally the largest group of the most diverse group of animals by a lot.
The most diverse group of animals by. I mean, I would have thought that would have been something under the ocean. All right, I will take it and I will slam the table. What am I missing?
Insects.
Son of.
Yep.
Yep.
By far the most diverse group of animals.
Insects, those
Yes.
little
So
bugs.
let's talk about them and how each of them are different. So I will say up front, this is going to be focusing more on the vertebrates. The birds, pterosaurs, not pterodactyls. Pterosaur is the proper term, and
Mm-hmm.
bats, because those are the ones that I personally know the best. Insects are so just incredibly weird and crazy. We will talk about them, but we will probably be focusing more on the vertebrates. So, how are they different? So, you'd think, okay, well, they all fly, so they must have some kind of thing in common, right? And so, at least with the 3 vertebrate groups, pretty much the only things that they have in common, besides being vertebrates, are generally pretty light bones and a really big sternum. Other than that, that's kind of it.
When you say light bones, does like are they just less dense? I've heard like hollow bones. I don't know if that's just not a thing. When we say light bones, what are we talking about?
Generally, it means that there are, instead of having solid bones like you or I do, I mean, not truly solid because the inside of your bone is, pretty porous and kind of spongy actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what flying vertebrates do is they turn just that big tube of where it's like hard on the outside and then spongy on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
They further compress like the spongy parts into struts inside the bone,
Hmm.
so that there are spots inside the bone that are not taken up by the spongy material, which is still bone, so it's still pretty dense
Right.
in mammals like you and me. Um, but because they put it into these struts, they make it about as structurally sound while being a lot lighter.
Okay, so it seems like it's just a more efficient way of doing bone.
Right, and it's like it is very good for the kinds of stresses involved with flying. It is not very good. You can snap a chicken bone just sort of very easily with your hands without much force. So they
So I've
tend,
heard.
yeah, they tend to be more brittle, but for the kind of stresses that flying puts on the bones, just as strong as if they were not lightened in this way. Birds sort of do it a little weird, and this is also kind of a dinosaur thing because there are quite a few dinosaurs that do this too. Um, but birds actually do have air sacs in some of their bones
Hmm.
as part of, not just like a ball of air. It is part of their breathing system.
Oh goodness,
And
really?
like I am not gonna go
What?
into yeah, I'm not gonna go into all that. We can do an entire episode about birds. I
Can
would
we
love
please?
that. Yeah. So I'm not going to go into that super in depth here, but basically it's so that they constantly have fresh air in their lungs. Birds have probably by far the most like sophisticated and efficient breathing system of any living vertebrates. It is crazy how efficient bird respiration is, which makes sense because they need so much more energy, which you get by breathing. That's like how your body produces energy is it needs the oxygen from the air that you breathe.
Hmm.
And if you have, roughly 50% of the time, you have stale air in your lungs, right? Because you breathe in and out. Birds sort of do it in like a loop system. So there's much more frequently fresh air in their lungs. Again, not going to go super into all the physiology behind it, but it's crazy. And that involves some air sacs in their bones. But yeah, like I said, birds do it a little weird. That's a thing that they actually got from dinosaurs. So other than that's basically all they have in common. And they have the big sternum or a big keel on their sternum is what it's called, basically to attach big muscles for flapping. Your pec muscles essentially. They
Hmm.
make those nice and big, which is why chicken breasts are very frequently eaten by people because
Yeah.
that's just a big hunk of meat. And chickens can't even fly that well. Granted, we've bred them to have big, breasts because we like to eat it, but things, bigger, more flighted birds, massive, massive muscles there. And because they're so big, they need a big bone to be able to attach to that won't break under the stress that they impart on it while
That
flying.
makes that makes total sense. The
Hmm.
having a bigger, if there's going to be one bone that was going to be big and sturdy, it'd be the bone that you need to attach, all of that muscle to. That makes total sense. I never would have when you first said that I was like, I wonder why that is, but that makes
Hmm.
total sense.
And we'll also talk a bit about bird legs in a little bit here, but we'll focus on sort of the arms for now. Um, so each of these four groups have vastly different wings. We will circle around to insect wings later because those are the craziest. But so with the vertebrates, with it's not like they grew an extra set of limbs to be their wings. So they basically just turn their arms into wings, right?
Okay.
But they did it in very,
Yeah.
very different ways.
Hmm. Okay. So they both wound up in the same place by turning their arms into wings, but they did it in different ways.
Right. So
Huh.
birds, it's a little controversial with birds, but most people say that they ditched their pinky and their ring finger. They no longer have those two fingers. They fuse all the bones sort of in your hand that aren't your fingers, those, your metacarpals, or
Right.
what those are called. They fuse those all up into one sort of solid mass, and that's something you'll find that a lot of flying organisms do, is they fuse up bones also to help with that structural integrity while lightening them. And that includes the fingers. They fuse their two remaining fingers together, so their pointer finger and their middle finger, fuse those together. And then their thumb is reduced to just one bone that controls one single feather called the alula. And that sort of helps them decide the shape of their wing as they're flying and sort of change that. It helps them just have better control over their wing.
Right.
Um, And so, because it's fused like that, the only sort of motion that they have left in their hand at all is sort of if you were to hold your arm straight out to your side at like shoulder height,
That's exactly what I'm doing right now.
move your wrist forward and backward.
Mm-hmm.
That is sort of the only range of motion that they have in their hand. The rest of their wing is very highly controlled with lots and lots of small muscles. But in their hand, that's sort of it. They can also sort of rotate their wrist a little bit, but not too
Mm-hmm.
much.
I just want to be
Um,
sure that I'm understanding this here. When you're
mhm.
saying that I can move my wrist up and down, that is not like the flapping of the wings, is it?
No, 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 no.
I didn't think so. Okay.
That's just sort of changing the shape of the wing, essentially.
Right. 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 Right.
So next we have bats. So bats, if you've ever seen a bat skeleton, you probably know this, or even just sort of seen a picture of a bat. They
I'm gonna
just
Google that
make
right now.
they just make all of their fingers except for their thumb. So they make their four long fingers even longer. They just make them real
Oh
long.
yeah, I have seen this stuff before, and it's
Hmm.
creepy and
It's
awesome. And I
super
love it.
creepy. Yep, they just make them real long, and they stretch a bunch of skin in between them. And so the skin is called a patagium, or plural patagia. So they have patagia between each of their fingers, between weirdly their wrist and their shoulder. They have a flap of skin as well that sort of comes across the inside part of the elbow.
Mm-hmm.
They have a patagium from the end of their pinky to their foot, which is sort of the one of the main parts of the wings, and then also a patagium between each of their feet and their tail as well. So they are basically just a. I've heard bats described as toothpicks wrapped in tissue paper, and
I love that description.
I think it's a pretty fair description.
If you guys get the chance, definitely go look up bat skeleton. There's
It's
a million
so
different
weird.
pictures, and like that does fit just how long and skinny
Hmm.
those bones are. Like, yeah, toothpicks.
And it's not just their fingers that get real long. All of the bones in their arm get real long. Their humerus isn't super long, so like their upper arm bone isn't super elongated, but they're from their elbow to their wrist, super super long. Um, and then, like I said, their thumb is not extended. That still has a claw on it, and that's they sort of when they're some of them do like crawl around on the ground. In fact, that's how like vampire bats eat. They actually kind of hop around on the ground and nibble at like the ankles of cattle and drink their blood. So they don't just like land on things and bite their necks like that. That's typically not how they feed. Um, but bats that sort of cling to walls and things, they sort of bring in their fingers, essentially like they're making a thumbs up, right? So your four fingers are sort of curled in on themselves, and then they basically just like cling with their thumb.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's how bats do it. And then pterosaurs, they basically ditch their pinky finger, so they no longer have a pinky. And instead of they do like a half bird, half bat, in that they extend only one finger. They extend their ring finger to be like longer than the entire rest of their body,
Oh
and then
goodness.
stretch
Okay.
one big flap of skin. It depends on the group, but typically from the end of their ring finger to their hip ish.
Okay.
Um, but that leaves their thumb, pointer, and ring or middle finger free to walk around on because pterosaurs were actually quadrupedal.
Really? So they
Yeah,
walked on 4 feet, 4 legs.
right. So they basically, and I think that this I'm fairly confident that this next part is true because I don't know how else they would do it. But they basically reverse the joint for their ring finger so that instead of folding down like the other three fingers, it folds up.
Oh, I mean,
Be,
that
well,
feels
it'll
like it
be.
hurts.
I
Ow.
mean, for them, probably no,
No,
but
I like for them it's fine, but it's like, ugh.
right, because they have in order to like fold their wing up sort of
Hmm.
against the rest of their body while the rest of their hand is sort of facing down, like palm down.
Hmm.
So that's how they do their wing. And then insects, ooh boy.
This seems like so before you even get started, this
Yeah.
seems like a category that is so broad that like you would need to talk about them in subcategories,
Hmm.
or are they really all, kind of similar in that respect?
So each of these realistically should have their own episode, but we're going to talk about just sort of like how they got to be that way because frankly, with the exception of birds, we're not entirely sure how the other three groups got to be that way
Hmm.
because we don't have good transitions for them. We don't really, especially before DNA. So, I mean, that also sort of goes into like the macaw, genome sequencing that we were talking about earlier. Before
Right.
DNA, we had no idea where bats sort of fell on like the mammal family tree. We had
Right.
absolutely no idea. And it's only
Hmm.
since we've started doing more DNA sequencing that we've actually sort of figured it out. Um, but yeah, so bats are probably most closely related to things like shrews. We had thought that they were in a group with rodents and primates, but that turned out not to be the case with DNA. Um, yeah, so they're not even all that closely related to rodents, which kind of surprised me. I had always sort of learned that, but they're
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
not all that closely related.
Yeah. I mean, I had no idea.
Hmm. So birds, as we've talked about, are reptiles. They are archosaurian reptiles, which means that's basically the group that includes birds, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodilians. Which means that archosaurs are the only group to produce two different flying groups, which is really weird.
Yeah.
And then,
Especially that they're
oh, go
the
ahead,
only
go ahead.
one. Like, no, just that they're the only one. You'd think if
Hmm.
one was going to do it, more than one would do it.
Yeah, exactly. And then insects are arthropods. They are so weird with how they fly. I will dedicate some time in a little bit about when talk about how they evolved flight, with talking about some of their flight mechanics. But I'm sure you've probably heard things like, you know, we don't understand the physics behind like how bees fly. Like physics says that like bumblebees, for example, shouldn't be able to fly.
I've always kind of assumed that like that was just BS, but is it true?
Yeah, yeah, yes and no. Um, I'm neither a physicist nor an entomologist, which is what you call someone who studies insects. Um, so I don't know how true that is. I know that there are many other types of insects where it's like you flap your wings faster than nerves can process and information.
That seems
So
really fast.
yes, some insects like just regular houseflies flap their wings in the like hundreds of times per second, which
Which is
is
faster than nerves
way
can move, I
faster than
assume. Okay.
yes. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So that's sort of the structure of at least the three vertebrates. With insects, their wings are kind of varied, honestly, but they're structured similarly to their legs, which is a little foreshadowing for later. Um, so we talked about these three groups. They fly. A little bit about the shape of their wings, but why would things fly to begin with? What would make them fly? What do you think?
So I'm trying to think of different reasons they could fly. Number one, it could be that they have a food source that is high up. So, for a similar reason that, at least I think, that giraffes have evolved long necks, maybe other animals took a different approach to get to food that was up high. Another reason could be if they're living on, let's say, islands,
Hmm.
and they need to, they need to kind of hop around islands or just different areas of land that are surrounded by water or mostly surrounded by water. They need to be able to get around. Or they're just not well suited to extreme cold or extreme heat, and they needed a way to like get from extreme cold to extreme heat and then back again, every 6 months or so.
Okay.
And so flight was sort of the best way to do it. Those second two strike me as kind of poor reasons
Hmm.
for evolution to get involved, because just the way at least I understand evolution, I wouldn't think that like that would be the solution that would, that would just kind of naturally
Right.
evolve or anything else. So I'm going to go with the food reason, or to evade prey. I guess it'll be kind of the my addendum to that one.
That is pretty much right. And granted, as I think I sort of alluded to earlier, the fossil records for most of these groups are not good. So it's not like we can have a great record to be like, okay, these other things were happening at the same time
Hmm.
to sort of maybe be like, okay, this new predator showed up. Maybe that sort of drove them to do X thing. It's really hard to say that when the transitional fossils for three of these four groups are just don't exist. Um, so
For three of the four, holy crap! Wow.
right, we have transitional fossils for birds, which we'll talk about a bit, but for bats, pterosaurs, and insects, we just don't have them. Uh, a big part of it is that like bats don't tend to preserve especially well because like if you drop a toothpick wrapped in tissue paper on the ground, it's going to fall apart.
The tissue paper, you mean?
Well, like I said, with bats, bats are
Hmm.
essentially toothpicks wrapped in tissue paper.
Right.
If you take that bundle and just
Hmm.
drop it on the floor of a forest, it's going to fall apart pretty quickly.
Right.
And as we've talked about, in order for things to become fossilized, they need to be buried pretty quickly. Um, and generally, these groups don't tend to live in places that do that very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. And then another part of it is that, like, it just happened very, very quickly. And there's a reason that things like clams have a great fossil record, is because most species of clams are around for a really long time. Whereas these transitional fossils, just because they're around for such a short amount of time, is because, we have poor fossils on them because they were around for such a short amount of time. There wasn't a lot of time for there to be a lot of different individuals to be fossilized to begin with, if that makes sense.
Can you say it one more time?
Basically, the shorter of an amount of time that a species is around for, the
Right.
less of a chance there is for it to become a fossil.
That makes sense. And when you say like less amount of time that it's around for, do you
Mhm.
mean the lifespan of an individual organism or just like
No,
the total amount of time that a species has existed?
right. The total amount of time for a species, just
And
because
that makes
of
total sense.
right. Uh, and from everything that we can tell, these things went from not flying to flying very, very quickly. Because, with the exception of birds, the things that we think are like pterosaur ancestors or bat ancestors were very much not flying and didn't have a lot of the things that make bats bats. You know, they just didn't have a
Right.
lot of the same features. So they must have developed those features very quickly. And I keep saying birds are sort of the exception because, we have dinosaurs with feathers. Most dinosaurs have, those kind of quote unquote hollow bones. Uh, they have generally bigger, powerful legs, which, as I sort of mentioned earlier, at least the group of dinosaurs that birds came from walked on two legs. So they had to have, and these even smaller group that birds came from tended to be pretty quick, fast running animals. So they had sort
Hmm.
of these relatively big, beefy legs. Um, and that becomes kind of important because, to get into the air, you don't flap yourself into the air generally, at least not with birds.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah. So
Oh,
there,
okay. How
there's
do you get in the air?
there's a reason also that drumsticks are also a really popular piece of bird meat. They have these big chunky legs because birds literally jump their own height or higher and then start flapping.
Really?
If you ever watch like a slow motion video of like a pigeon taking off, they will jump about their own height and then flap, 3 or 4 times or more in the first like couple seconds of takeoff, and then they're good to go. Um, Bats generally don't need to do that because when they are not flying, they're typically hanging from a tree or something, so they can just kind of drop and then pick up from there. Uh, there's some exceptions, like I said, with the vampire bats that kind of do hang out on the ground a little bit. Um, they have to sort of push up themselves off the ground a little bit, or sometimes they'll just go find something to climb and then drop from it and fly.
Okay.
And for a
But
long time, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but like, regardless, it sounds like there's very little that um there's very little flying species of birds or anything else that just like starts flapping. Like they either fall or they jump up or like something happens where like the flapping comes second, which I
Right.
is wild.
Insects probably do, like, they probably start off flapping, but everything with insects is weird. So,
Hmm.
um, and then with pterosaurs, and this is actually a relatively recent discovery, in the last probably decade or so, because we used to think, most of the places where we find pterosaur fossils are generally kind of coastal environments. So we had kind of assumed that they lived mostly on cliffs and then would have to like jump off the cliffs in order to fly. Because of the, four groups that can fly, they are the best at sort of just like existing on the ground.
Hmm.
So it's like if they had to sort of walk around until they found a cliff to jump off of, they could probably do that.
Right.
However, a more recent sort of model. So somebody, analyzed a bunch of skeletons and, came up with like a 3D model that essentially they just do like a super push up.
Really?
And
A super push-up?
yep, so they just super push up themselves off the ground and then spread out their arms. So they, like I said, how birds can jump their own height.
Mm-hmm.
Pterosaurs, we think, and again, because it's an entirely fossil group, we don't have any living pterosaurs, obviously.
Right, we can't be
This this
sure, but
this is all theoretical, right? But this evidence seems pretty convincing that they could essentially push up themselves their own height, spread out their wings, and then start flapping.
that's amazing.
Yeah, and
Why can't
it's
we do that, man? That's amazing.
that leads me into something else that I'll talk about in a second. But so with pterosaurs, it makes it really convenient because your takeoff muscles also help with flying. With birds, not so much.
Right, because it's like legs, and I imagine that when it comes to strictly flying, legs are going to be more of a drag than anything else.
Not as much a drag as it like they don't make it fly slower as much as just like heavy weight that you are no longer currently using.
Right.
There are some exceptions with things like falcons. They
Hmm.
use their legs in hunting, and falcons typically
Hmm.
eat other birds. So falcons will just fly really high, dive at them, and then basically just punch them real hard as they're flying,
Oh God.
and then knock the bird out, and then they, come down and finish the job and have a meal. Um, Other birds, such as like eagles and things that sort of grab fish from lakes and ponds, it does help with like their food, but it doesn't really help with their flying. But with pterosaurs, it's all in one convenient package. So that potentially, some people, and the evidence for this I haven't seen be super well supported, but that's sort of evidence that some people have pointed to why pterosaurs were able to get so much bigger than the biggest flighted birds that we know of.
Say that again.
So pterosaurs,
The,
on
the
average, are much
why were they
much bigger,
bigger? Why were they bigger than the biggest flighted birds that we know of?
right? Because they didn't have to. They could afford to be bigger and still fly because all of their muscles, having bigger takeoff muscles also helped in flying and supporting their bigger weight. Whereas if a bird needs these big honking chunky legs just to get off the ground, they can only get so big and still be able to fly.
So that's why birds are small, generally speaking,
Right.
and almost always. Yeah.
This is again, I haven't seen this be super well supported, but that's what some people have sort of speculated about. Because like the largest pterosaurs were like small plane sized, like
Right.
20 plus foot wingspans, not uncommon. Usually some quite a bit larger than that, actually.
And that was all like so because they had bigger, a bigger flying apparatus, their body was set
Hmm.
up to do that. They could, lift up more weight, which is why they were able to get larger than today's birds and bats and insects.
That is what is claimed. Insects are a completely different thing. There is something
Right.
else that
Okay.
limits insects, but
Gotcha.
um, yeah, with bats and birds, that's again not incredibly well supported from what I've seen, but what some people have talked about.
All right. So it is a hypothesis and not
Hmm.
necessarily to be taken as fact at this point. On we are recording this on May 4th, 2021. It is currently 10:02 p.m. If further information comes out, we will cover it.
I'm sure we will. So another thing that is sort of like still going off this question that I had before. So why would things fly? Why would they evolve? As sort of a side effect of that is flying species tend to be some of the most diverse groups. So I guess flying groups tend to be much more diverse than non-flying groups. For example, bats are not the most diverse mammals, but the second most diverse mammals. Even still, they make up like 20% of all mammals. Bats are Very, very diverse.
Wait, say that again. Wait,
Ba-
that bats make up 20% of all mammals.
Yep.
Can, okay, so there's a couple different ways that could be defined in my head. One
One
of
out of
which
five
is
mammals is a bat.
when you say that, like, are we talking about just like every mammal ever? So like you and I would count as two different mammals,
No,
or
in
okay,
terms of species.
different species. Okay, that was I was trying to figure out
Hmm.
exactly what that meant, but even still,
Hmm.
what?
Oh yeah,
Why?
only rodents,
Why?
only rodents are more diverse than them.
Wait, there's one that's more than bats?
Yeah, rodents are crazy, but
That's amazing.
they don't fly. We're not talking about them. Uh,
Not
bir-
yet.
Birds are the most diverse tetrapods, so vertebrates that live on land. Uh, so bats, for reference, have about 1,400 different species. Birds, depending on who you ask, um, there's a very large philosophical question in biology. It's just like, what even is a species? Again, totally different topic, but depending on what species concept you use, there are somewhere between 9,000 and 18,000 species of birds. Again, relative to the 1,400 species of bats.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's those two. Pterosaurs, it's hard to say from an entirely extinct group how many there were, but we do know that they were around for a real long time. So just because they're extinct doesn't mean that they were bad at doing their thing. They were around for like 150 million years.
That seems like a while.
It's a very long time. So just because they're not around anymore doesn't mean that they were bad. And then insects, like we've talked about, are the majority of animals. Insects make up more than 50% of all animals.
Insects make up 50% of all animals.
Slightly more, again, depending on what species
That
concept you're
actually,
using.
I actually buy that. Just like how many little bugs there are.
Right, exactly. But a big part of why each of these groups are so diverse, or so it has been thought, is because they can fly. That opens
Hmm.
up a lot of different places for you to go. Especially for things like insects, you can have insects that only operate in the tops of trees. You can have insects that operate on the ground but can still fly to get away from, predators and things.
Right.
And uh not just that, but it opens yourself. You can just move much faster and disperse yourself across a larger area, and that's how evolution happens, just from, one population splitting into different populations that can no longer breed. That's essentially how new species are made. Um,
Hmm.
so if you can spread yourself over a larger area, you have a better chance of forming new species, and that's most likely why each of these groups are so diverse. Um, but as you sort of talked about, like, why can't we fly? Why, if flying's so cool and flying so beneficial in the way that birds do this, why doesn't everything fly?
I've had a lot of things like this. Like, why can't humans do a lot of things? But today
Hmm.
we'll just stick it to flying.
Right. So go ahead. Tell me why it is not beneficial for humans, for example, to have evolved flying.
Why it's not beneficial? Oh, I thought you were going to ask me why, like, why we can't fly. And I was like, well, like, we're too, like, our bones are too heavy. Like, we don't have
Right, but
that. Why
why?
is it not beneficial?
Right, if flying is so good,
So,
it lets you escape predators so efficiently. It lets you get food that you couldn't otherwise get. It lets you just travel a lot faster than you could otherwise. So if it's so cool, why hasn't everything evolved the ability to fly?
I mean, I think I just like to blame Charles Darwin for being a jerk. But besides that, I'm going to go with the fact that humans were able to evade predators and get food reasonably well as is without needing to be able to fly. And so there was just, evolution, doesn't have a brain or a thought process, but there was just no need to for humans to evolve because like we had it covered as is, while being on the ground. That's kind of my hypothesis.
That is exactly right. That is
Perfect. Okay.
more or less exactly how evolution works. Just because doing X thing or developing, X body part into Y body part would be beneficial doesn't automatically mean that that's gonna happen.
Right. It's not needed. And also, like you said, the fact that the bones that are required to fly in birds and bats and everything, like that does take like there is a cost to evolving that.
There
And
absolutely
so
is.
Right, it is. As much as I would like to be able to fly, and like I'd make that trade, humans as a species, that would be a rather significant trade-off based on what you've described to me. Like we just wouldn't
Hmm.
be all that durable of a species, terrestrially.
Right. And the biggest thing is that you sort of mentioned there is cost, mostly energy cost, because birds, you know, especially considering that birds are reptiles, they are they have by far the fastest metabolism of any reptiles, faster metabolisms than most mammals.
Really?
Yeah, like, if you don't feed your dog for like a couple days, it'll be fine. Like, it'll be hungry. I mean, and don't do this. Don't not feed your dog.
But yeah, like we are against starving your dog on this podcast and outside of this podcast, frankly.
Right. But it's like, if you didn't feed your dog for even say like a week, it'd be miserable. It would be very unhappy. It'd probably be kind of weak, but it would be alive. A bird, if a bird does not eat like every day, probably multiple times a day, it will die.
Hmm.
So that's why people who keep birds as pets like blow my mind, especially people like falconers. Because you see people with falcons or eagles and things, and you're like, oh, cool bird, man. Uh,
Right.
but it's like you only see them do the cool tricks with it. You don't see the 4 times a day that they have to feed it, because
That
that's how much
right.
energy birds need to be able to maintain the metabolism, to be able to have the energy to always fly at a moment's notice. Similar thing with bats. There's a reason that bats, eat several thousand insects a night.
Several thousand?
I mean, I'm sure it depends, but like they eat probably like their own body weight a day,
That's awesome. Why
right?
can't I do that? Why haven't we evolved to be able to do that?
Because we don't fly.
You know,
I mean, I'm sure if
I'm going back
you
to blaming Darwin on this. Darwin could have just invented evolution different and we'd be all set.
okay, but here's the thing though. I'm sure if you ran nonstop every second that you were awake, you'd probably be able to eat significantly more food than you currently do a day.
I would co-sign onto that. That seems logical.
Because, I mean, think about it, especially things like hummingbirds are an extreme example, because hummingbirds eat like more than their body weight in food a day,
Oh my
which is a lot
god.
easier when you're really small,
Right.
to be fair.
But
But
even still, like,
it's like, it's not like, things like hawks and eagles, they can sort of just spread their wings out and kind of chill and just kind of move very slowly, which is very energy efficient. Things like hummingbirds that flap their wings, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of times per second. Yeah, if they do not get food every like 15 to 20 minutes while they are awake, they die.
I guess that makes some like that is rather energy intensive.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, I guess, gotta hand it to him. I guess that makes sense.
So that is probably the biggest cost, is that flying is just very, very expensive energetically, as well
Hmm.
as the things that you talk about with making you way less durable. If
Right.
you hit, if you like flick, a cat or a dog, it'll be fine. It might be a little annoyed. If you flick a bird on its wing, that could like break part of its wing,
Which could mean
which
death.
means the bird dies pretty
Right.
much. So lots of reasons to fly, lots and lots of reasons to not fly. So how did flight even evolve? If that's the case, then how did this sort of happen? With birds, like I said, we actually have a good path. We have a good path of dinosaur to like sort of bird to like full bird. We have lots of dinosaurs that very clearly did not fly, that have feathers. Feathers probably evolved for either some kind of display. You know, a male has, similar to birds today, have like bright feathers trying to impress the ladies. Um, or potentially, they more likely they evolved for thermoregulation, being able to keep some heat in as well. We even have dinosaurs with long feathery arms that did not fly. We think that they sort of use these either for, again, like display and attracting mates and things, or potentially covering their nest better.
Right.
And then, we have sort of the transition between things like Archaeopteryx, which most people sort of know as the first bird, even though we've since found some ones that are a little older than that. And there's actually been some studies that say Archaeopteryx probably couldn't fly very well at all.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so we have a very clear transition. There were dinosaurs with feathers, including very small dinosaurs with feathers. And for a very long time, the hypothesis was that they started off gliding from tree to tree, and that the feathers helped them glide. And then eventually, maybe they needed to glide a farther distance, so they threw a little flappy action in there. And that, over thousands and thousands of generations, that led to true powered flight like we see in birds today. Which intuitively makes kind of sense, because it's like you're already in the air, right?
Right.
However, that is no longer sort of what we think happened with birds. And
Okay, go on.
I've heard this phrased as, so there's sort of two different schools of thought. There's the tree down, meaning you start in the trees and you then were able to fly, or the ground up, meaning you started terrestrially and then you started flapping and then you could fly.
Can I ask
And
one question ahead of time?
yeah,
Are they mutually exclusive? Like, does it have to be one or the other, or are both of those like could they have both happened?
so based on the evidence that we have, we're pretty sure that at least the lineage for birds only evolved flight once.
Mm-hmm. So
So,
that would make it mutually exclusive then, it seems.
right. That is the best evidence that we have. I've often sort of questioned whether that was actually true, but this is not the group that I study, so I'll trust the people who spend more time on this than I do.
Right.
Um, but so the way I've heard it phrased is that the tree down sounds so obvious that everything else sounds stupid.
Okay.
Because it just, like I said, makes way more sense. It's like you're already in the tree, you're already gliding through the air. It makes sense that you just, again, throw some actual flapping action in there and then you're able to fly. That just sounds so obvious that starting on the ground and then being able to fly sounds like it doesn't even make sense. However, that's sort of not what we think anymore. We think that it actually was the ground up sort of.
So the not obvious answer happens to be the one that is currently in vogue at the very least.
Right. And again, this is something that is still pretty controversial within, the people that study this. So this is not a settled thing. But from the evidence that I've seen, from what I've been taught, it does seem like the ground up makes more sense, especially when you're considering things like Archaeopteryx, because a lot of the very first bird-ish things still had these really long, pretty beefy legs. So the current thought is that they sort of already had these long feathers on their arms for display or covering their eggs or things that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And, as they were sort of running up hills or things like that, they started flapping their arms and then were able to sort of jump farther because of that.
Okay.
So they used it to sort of help power themselves forward a little bit almost.
Right, and eventually that just keeps going and going until
Exactly.
flight.
Right.
Okay. I guess that makes some amount of sense.
And so the reason why, and listeners, you can see we're getting close to an hour here. The reason why I've been talking so much about birds is because, for like I've mentioned, for the other three groups, we don't have any. we have that nice transition with birds. We don't, like I said, we barely know what group bats are closest related to. With pterosaurs, it's like we think their closest relatives are dinosaurs. But it's like the first time we see something that is vaguely pterosaur-like, we're pretty sure it can already fly. The first fossil bat that we see, we're pretty sure it can already fly.
And so there's just there's not like that very nice, slow, gradual progression. It's like, oh wow, bats.
Right. It's like you go from little shrew-like thing to bat, seeming geologically overnight. And so we don't really know how the other groups got to be the way they are. We don't really even have great hypotheses for bats or pterosaurs. With bats, we have a little better than with pterosaurs. We think that bats may actually have started as like they may actually have been like the tree down sort of thing, just because some of their close relatives do live in trees. Like we know that. Um, the first fossil bats that we have still had claws at the end of each of their still already super long fingers. So it's like they may have used those for gripping trees and climbing them to be able to jump off. Um, so with bats, that's probably the best evidence that we have. Like slightly leads toward already being in trees, having longer fingers with skin between them in order to glide from tree to tree. But there are lots of mammals that have big flaps of skin that are used to glide. Things like sugar gliders, things like flying squirrels.
Right.
That's do fine. They don't
Hmm.
they don't fly. They don't
I was
even.
gonna say, is that like I'm assuming that has nothing to do with flying. Like that
That
is
has nothing to do with flying.
right. Okay.
And it might make more sense if we found some kind of like truly flying squirrel, because flying squirrels are called that because they glide, they don't actually fly.
Right.
If we found a type of squirrel in the fossil record that could actually fly, maybe there'd be a lot more credence to a tree down hypothesis. But as of right now, it's like we don't really know. And then with pterosaurs, how they just got that one super long finger, we don't know. We have no idea. um, and so with insects, I've been saying that we're going to circle around to it, and we are now circled. Uh,
All
so
right.
insects, A, did flying way before anybody else. Like insects started flying around the same time that vertebrates like came on land.
That makes sense just because I'm assuming they're smaller and were around first and just like would have had more time to get to that point.
Um, I'm trying to think when insects first, or at least arthropods first started coming on land. Um, I'd say not quite. So I'd say like the time between when arthropods came on land to when insects started flying was a little shorter than when vertebrates came on land and pterosaurs started to fly, because pterosaurs were the first vertebrate flyers.
Hmm.
I'd say
Okay.
that time was a little shorter, but not by a ton.
Hmm.
And around the time when insects started to fly, they were bigger than they are today. Not by a ton. They would get very much larger a little bit later. But yeah, I don't. Size might have had a little bit to do with it, but I don't think that was the main thing. Because if you think
So,
about
so
with insects, if you're the main thing about the tree down hypothesis was like, if you already live in the trees and you want to be able to jump to get something that's trying to eat you in the trees, you want to be able to jump and then not die.
that would be the goal.
That's not a thing with insects. Insects, you can drop them from any height and they will be fine.
I'm assuming it's because their terminal velocity is so low that it's just not going to kill them.
That is correct. Um, so yeah, they can jump from the tallest tree on the planet and hit the ground below it and be completely fine. Might be a little like stunned, but it'll live. Uh, so that wasn't really a thing. And so as I mentioned, insects do flying super weird in that they do it sort of two different ways. There are some the ones that flap their wings faster than like the nerves theoretically should be able to process it.
Hmm.
They you would think they would need muscles to flap their wing, right? That just intuitively makes sense.
I'm assuming you're going to tell me that's not the case, but yeah.
Not directly anyway. There are two different kinds of insect flight. There's direct flight and indirect flight. I'm sure that's not the proper terms, but that's how I've heard it phrased.
Go on.
Ones
This
one
planet's so weird, man.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
know. Ones that fly with direct flight are things like your dragonflies, things like most like beetles and things, where they have muscles, inside their exoskeleton that do flap their wings. Similar musculature for like their legs. for example. But things like flies and bees have indirect uh, flight, where their muscles flex their exoskeleton instead of their wings.
Wait, what?
So they flex their exoskeleton so incredibly fast that I've also heard it phrased that, because this action is so much faster than a nerve can hypothetically do that, it's much more like an on or off switch. So it's like, I am flying, I am not flying. So it's not like they're thinking like flap, 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 like a bird might. It's
Right.
like, okay, flight on, flight off. And it's just a such fast twitch thing that it's like, insects are just so incredibly weird. That's not the best way of explaining it, but that is how it has been explained to me.
So are there bones?
They
Or
don't
no, they're
have bones.
yeah, I was gonna. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
So
That's
that
nuts.
that
I'm
is
sorry. I don't have words. I don't. I'm supposed to be like the straight man, dumb guy here that asks questions, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how that works. But like, I don't even
Mhm.
have anything. Like that's no. That's amazing.
It really is. And so that's part of the reason why like I'm kind of avoiding talking about insects a lot in this episode, because I don't know how they work and it freaks me out.
Who should know
Uh,
how they work? They don't even know how they work.
but we do have actually some better hypotheses about how they formed their wings than we do with bats or pterosaurs. Um, Sort of conversely to that, actually, at least we know what limb bats and pterosaurs made their wing from. We know that they made it from their arms.
Right.
With insects, we're like, did you used to have an extra set of legs that you turned into wings? Like, what even is that? With insects, we don't even really know. Did their wings used to be legs? It's got veins and things in them. So it's, not like it's just like a piece of, exoskeleton. They just like flap, flap, flap. There's veins. So it's like, could it have been a leg? That's like a hypothesis that I don't think is super well supported these days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Something that is potentially more supported, and I think the leading hypothesis these days is that it is left over from many of the oldest or most quote unquote primitive groups of insects have aquatic larvae.
Aquatic larvae.
Right, things like dragonflies. Dragonfly nymphs live in the water, and then when
Right.
they're ready to mature, they like climb out on like a cattail or something, molt, and they suddenly have wings. Again, insects are not my thing, but that is more or less how it works. Um, but because they live underwater, they have to have gills, right?
Right. I would
Presumably.
assume. Yeah.
So a lot of them actually have muscles attached to their gills, because otherwise, you've probably heard sort of the myth that like sharks can't breathe if they're not moving.
I actually haven't, but I'll trust you.
Okay, that's sort of a relatively common thing, and it's like that's true for some sharks, but not quite. But basically, in order for gills to work, you need to have water flowing over them, essentially.
Okay. There has to be like new oxygen going. It's dispersed in the water that's going by their gills. I assume.
Exactly. Uh,
Okay.
so a way that a lot of insects, or even some like salamanders that have gills as well, the way they sort of get around that is they just put some muscles on their gills and they sort of flap them to move them through the water instead of moving water over them.
Hmm.
Do you see where I'm sort of going with this here?
No, help me out here. Finish the story for me.
The thought is that from these very primitive insect ancestors, when they would mature, they would keep their gills, and over time, somehow turned those gills into wings.
Because things were passing over them, like the water was passing
Because
over,
they
and
already
then
had the musculature there.
wow, wow, that
Because there's been some other hypotheses, like there
I was
are.
that doesn't again as a total layperson that doesn't strike me as like what I would have guessed. But
Mhm.
again, like as you mentioned a couple, like not my thing. So I'm not saying that anyone doesn't get
Right.
it. Like it's just like that is wild to me.
Exactly. I mean, well, when you've got, tens to dozens of millions of years of time to just sort of play around.
Yeah, well, right.
But so there are other features, like there are sort of like flaps of like exoskeleton that some insects use that aren't very good at flying, use as sort of like parachutes, even though yes they can survive a fall from really high, if it stuns them a little bit they could still get eaten, so they still want to fall relatively slowly.
Right.
um so some people kind of thought, okay, maybe that was where wings came from, something similar to that, but those don't have musculature with them. They're just sort of like drag flaps on a plane.
Hmm.
So it's that intuitively might make a little more sense, but when you get into the actual anatomy, not as much, because there's no muscles to them, there's no joint to them. So it's and I want to say that there's another hypothesis out there as well, because I think um so we very commonly, we as in like scientists in labs and things, like to play with fruit flies.
Because they can reproduce really quickly, and so you get lots of generations all at once.
Exactly. So, but not just that. That's why we understand fruit fly genetics really, really well. But I think pretty much anyone who's taken like a genetics class in college has played around with fruit flies a little bit. But because we've used them for so many experiments and things, for those reasons that you said, just such a short lifespan and such a quick regeneration cycle,
Hmm.
um, we understand their genetics extremely well. And because of that, we can tinker a bit because we know what every gene does. And so it is actually quite easy to actually not turn the wings quite into legs, but with just a very small tweak, they sort of turn into sort of a jointed appendage similar to legs. They don't have like the foot on them that insect legs do.
Right.
Um, but it is like a three jointed appendage like insect legs. So that's also another thought, that maybe, insect ancestors had 8 legs instead of 6, and one of them turned into wings.
Huh.
Which of those makes more sense? I have no idea.
So basically the takeaway from all this is that not only do you and I, but like the scientific community itself doesn't have a great grasp on how insects insects got got flight.
That is definitely right.
There's a lot of hypotheses, some of which make plenty of sense, other of which blow my mind, but you know we're trying to figure it out. It's a work in progress.
Exactly. And that sort of wraps up Flight. This was a very, very quick and dirty, even though this is probably one of the longer episodes that we have. Um, each of these groups individually is so incredible. And actually, because I had mentioned how diverse the other 3 groups were, and sort of just mentioned offhandedly that insects were the majority of animals, I don't think I actually gave a number to that, unless I'm mistaken.
I don't remember, so even if you did, by all means.
So currently there are around 1 million species of insects described and like given a name and everything.
Right.
In reality, we probably estimate there's around but somewhere between 6 million and 10 million species of insects.
And how does that relate to the total number of animals?
Again, we don't even pretend that we have everything described or
Hmm.
really close. But I
Right.
would say if there are 6 million species of insects, I would say there are probably somewhere between 9 and 10 million species of animals total.
Wow.
Yeah, so on
That's just
average,
so many little bugs.
and like the by far the most diverse group of insects are beetles. Like statistically, the average animal is a beetle. Yeah, let that sink in a little bit.
Oh, it's so, like, never gonna sink. Just the way you frame, not like if you pick any animal at random, it's likely to be a beetle, but the average animal is a beetle. I love
Yes. Insects are
that.
so incredibly weird and diverse, and I hate them because I don't understand them, but also love them at the same time.
Oh, the love-hate relationship is sometimes what I have with you, Gavin, because sometimes you make me feel stupid, but most of the time you just make me love this planet and love everything around it and mostly love you, which is exactly what I like to hear. Is there any other mind-blowing stuff you have for me today, or are we going to wrap this up?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, I don't know about you. I personally would love to have the kind of muscles that allow me to just like do push-ups and launch myself 6 feet into the air, like a
I would like to
pterosaur.
have muscles
Personally,
that let me do, more than a
anything.
couple push-ups at a time, but moving on from that, I would love to one of these days. I don't know if we've ever done it, but I'd love to go like parasailing or even just skydiving and
I've
just.
been para sailing, the one where they tow you behind a boat.
Oh no, that's I'm sorry, not parasailing, paragliding, where like you get
Okay.
like the yeah those things. I would love to. I'd love to do that just to experience what it's like. You
See,
know.
for me, I really, really want. I don't think I ever will, just because I feel like it would require much training, and I don't have time for that. But I want to. I really want to use one of like the wing suits where you like
Yes,
skydive with like the membrane that goes from like your wrist to your waist on each side, and then like the
absolutely.
membrane between each of your legs. I would love to do
Hmm.
that because I mean
Absolutely.
that is absolutely gliding. Like there's no powered flight to that. But
Hmm.
that I think is truly as close as you can get to actually flying. Because
I
yeah,
would.
with like a hang glider, like you're controlling it and stuff, but it's not like you, you know.
Right. The closest I'm ever going to get to flying is wearing one of those suits or whatever. So one of these days, I would love to. I'd love to do something like that that involves me just being in the air for a prolonged period of time, even if it's just skydiving. Fine.
Same.
It's a thing I want to try.
Absolutely. Um but yeah, so I guess in closing, if you would like us to talk at length about any of these groups, please make sure to fill out the form down in the show notes. We'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And this has been episode 21 of I Wish You Were Dead. Our podcast is now legal to drink, and we are going to continue having a lot of fun things coming up in the weeks ahead. So Gavin, thank you very much, and we will see all of you guys next Wednesday.
Absolutely.